Hello. I'm going to record this for you here about the Restoration Movement and the beginnings of it. We've been talking about the Restoration Movement, and as you know, the plea of it is uniting all Christians by restoring the faith and practices of the New Testament. So the key words there are unite and restore. We're going to unite not just on the basis of anything or nothing, but we unite over the restoring of faith and practices of the New Testament. So this is mentioned, of course, unity. Jesus talks about unity in the Bible. John 17, Jesus prays for unity, that all of his followers would be one, like he and the Father are one. That's very much unified. But how can we achieve it? Of course, it's difficult, but it can be done. But it's going to be difficult to do it, I think. People have been trying. But we want to have unity and union. Your textbook is called Union and Truth. So I think that's the key of what Dr. North, Jim North, talks about, that we could be united by truth. Well, the Restoration Movement has four main leaders, most people would say. Three of them pictured here. Top and left up here is Thomas Campbell. This is Thomas Campbell. This is Barton Stone. Down here at the bottom is Alexander Campbell. Then I guess to the right Thomas, then up here Barton W. Stone. And then of course there's also Walter Scott. There are other important leaders as well. I think I would put in that list Rice Haggard. His name's going to come up. He's the one that really promotes the idea that people should just be called Christians. And so we see his name popping up, over in North Carolina, Virginia, and in Kentucky and other places, really stressing this name. Let's just be called Christians. Well, what we're going to find is that the Restoration Movement, interestingly enough, has three separate movements, okay? One in the South, and what we're calling the South is Virginia and North Carolina, centered around James O'Kelly and some things that happened with him and others. In the East, or in New England, two men, Abner Jones and Elias Smith. And then in what we might call the West, or the western part of the movement, this is in Kentucky, Western Virginia, which would be now known as West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Here, of course, the main leaders are the Campbells, Thomas and his son Alexander, and Barton W. Stone. Now, what's interesting about this is that these movements are simultaneous. That is, they're happening at the same time in different places. However, they begin without knowledge of each other. So they kind of come to some of the same principles, at the same time. So I think that is one thing that makes it interesting, is that they come up with some very similar ideas independently, and then eventually they find out about each other. Okay. So just to give you an idea on a map, here are the three areas. And of course, remember, we're talking about the early 1800s, so that really the West was Kentucky and Ohio, because most people had not settled much further than that, just making it, it through Kentucky, and not even all the way to the Mississippi River, but the Ohio River, and then, of course, up and down the coastal areas. So the Western movement there in the green color, the Eastern movement with the blue, and the Southern movement in the red. Okay? Now, similarities between these three regions as far as what they believe. Well, first one is them coming to this position and moving away from the other areas did not come without a struggle. And of course, they didn't come to all the what we might call restoration principles immediately, all the different teachings, all the different ideas. This is a development. This is something they're coming to understand. And I think it's also true that the leaders did not foresee where this might lead eventually, say to a movement or some kind of unity and so forth. All right, here's some of the key issues that they have to deal with. Church polity or government, that is, how will the church be run? Locally, and is it going to be locally? Is there going to be a bishop? Going to be some kind of church governance above the local congregation? And in the local congregation, how will it be run? So, for example, the Episcopal Church has bishops. This comes from the Greek word episkopos, for bishops, where bishops rule. There's a Presbyterian, so that's one style of church government, Episcopalian or Episcopal. A Presbyterian means the rule of elders or a group of elders, and this is usually over a region of churches. And then congregational, this might be what you're most used to. Congregational means the local congregations are autonomous. That is, they can make their own decisions and they don't have some kind of regional or national government over them. Another big issue for these groups is going to be baptism. Baptism. And baptism becomes a difficult situation because it's controversial, I suppose, because it has so many parts to it. You have to remember it has three main parts. One is the mode. That is the how. How is baptism going to take place? Okay? How will baptism take place? And typically there's three ways, right? There's immersion, there is sprinkling, and there is pouring. So how are we going to do baptism? The second one has to do with the meaning of baptism. The meaning of baptism is the why. Why should someone be baptized? Why do we baptize? And then the third is the subject, that is the whom. Whom should be baptized? Should this be someone who understands what's going on, like an adult, or someone who's a teenager, or even a child, maybe it's 10 years old, or an infant that obviously doesn't know what's going on? So these are three. So there are three elements of it, the how, the why, and the whom. All right, as we said, the mode, the how, sprinkling, pouring, or immersing. Okay. The subject, or the whom, typically either infants or adults, or some people say infants or believers, somebody who can actually understand and believe and confess, audibly, and that sort of thing. And then the meaning, is this for the remission of sins, or is this a symbol, a symbolic event, an act of obedience? You just do it because Jesus did it, you do it because you're commanded to do it, or is there more to it than that? Is this where your sins are removed? Okay, so that's why this gets so complicated. It's got at least these three different ideas, which each have two or three different options, right? So that makes a lot of different options. So we're going to come back to that, and basically, if we go back to this, in the Restoration Movement, they're going to come down to Congregationalism, where local congregations are autonomous, and when it comes to baptism, they're going to come down on the idea of immersing believers for the remission of sins. Okay, just to make it clear, this is going to be the position that is taken. Now, let's move to that Southern movement. Okay, James O'Kelly. James O'Kelly, 1738 to 1826. There's a little debate over the exact years there, but that's pretty close. He's in North Carolina and Virginia. There is also a little debate about where he was born. However, the guy who wrote his biography says he was born in Ireland, so I tend to go along with that. Well, what nobody has any question about is that he was a Methodist. He was connected to the Methodist movement. He was licensed to preach in 1774, and he was later ordained. Now, this is something we need to remember. Being licensed to preach is different than being ordained. We don't normally think of that, at least that's not been in my experience, that I have been with churches that license someone to preach and then also maybe ordained. So what this means is they needed preachers, and so they would license them to preach, but they would not be allowed to do things like weddings, giving communion, stuff like that. They'd have to be ordained, and a lot of times someone would be licensed and then later ordained. So you know, keep that in mind. During this period, that becomes an important thing, not only for the Methodists, but also later for the Presbyterians. Okay? So the Methodists in America, the Methodists come from the Wesleyan movement, the Wesley movement. This is John primarily, but also his brother Charles. They're from England. They are Anglican, or Church of England ministers. And they begin a kind of methodical Bible study within the Church of England in people's homes, and this is called the Wesleyan movement or Methodist movement because they had a methodical approach to the Bible. Now, there were also other names for them. Some people called them the Bible bigots, and some people called them the, sort of negative names because they really focused on the Bible. This all began, by the way, at Oxford University. And then John would preach. His brother Charles would write a lot of hymns. And this movement was there. Now, John Wesley never left the Church of England. Never, he never, I don't think, was really wanting to start another group of churches. However, that's what happens. The Methodist movement, which we have Methodists today, United Methodist, and several other branches of it. We'll see then, of course, when the Church of England is in America and the Methodist movement comes here. But when the Revolutionary War takes place, of course, no one wants to be identified with the Church of England if they're loyal to the United States, and so they begin to call it then the Episcopal Church. But the Methodism then becomes its sort of own thing, right? Its own group. Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury ran the churches, especially Asbury. And here we see a famous painting of Asbury riding the circuit. This became something that the Methodists were famous for. This is why the Methodists grew so quickly in the frontier areas where there weren't a lot of cities and towns, and sometimes there were churches in small villages or small towns, did not have ministers. And so what would happen is that the Methodist ministers rode horses like this. They rode from town to town. They had a circuit. That is, they would, let's say, have 4 different churches, and then they would go to one church one week, another the next, another the next, and so forth, so that they might be at a particular church maybe 12 times a year. And in the other intervening Sundays, then the local people would kind of run the service. They would have sort of lay ministers or leaders that would do prayers, and they would meet, maybe they would sing and things like that. But they would then wait. You'd have to wait for the minister to come into town and to come to the church. But Francis Asbury made appointments, that is, who was going to get which circuit and which churches, which congregations, and also would settle disputes. So some people didn't think this was a very fair system, because in fact, basically, Asbury sort of ran this himself because there was no one else around. So James O'Kelly was a Methodist minister. He and some other ministers wanted to have what was called the right of appeal. They wanted to be able to appeal the circuit or the congregations that they were assigned, and have some say in it, have some course to say, can you change this? We want to do something different than this. We want to have some input on this. By the way, here you see in the picture it says, erected by Christian Friends to the memory of James O'Kelly of North Carolina, the Southern champion of Christian freedom, 1738 to 1826. Well, there was a General Conference of the Methodists in 1792, and this right of appeal came up. Should the bishops appoint the preachers? Should the preachers be allowed to appeal? Now, Asbury didn't like this idea. It did not follow through. It didn't make it. And so we see then when O'Kelly was defeated, he and several other ministers withdrew in 1793. Okay, so when Kelly gets defeated, O'Kelly and his like-minded individuals, they decide they're going to leave, and they form what they come to call the Republican Methodist Church. This forms about 1793. There's about 30 ministers, but remember, each of those ministers is working with 3 to 5 congregations, so there's about 1,000 members. In 1794, Rice Haggard shows up at these, he's mentioned in the leadership here. And he says, you know what, you call yourselves Republican Methodist Church. Why don't you just call yourselves Christians? Just Christians. They like that idea, and so they accept it. So they begin to call themselves Christians. We see this happening at the old Lebanon Church, it's called, in Virginia, which is very close to the James River, very close to the North Carolina border. So I've been in that area, I've seen it, the place where it was, and Haggard's going to be the same guy who's going to later move to Kentucky, and he will make that same suggestion there to Barton W. Stone and some others there. So this name, Christian, begins to form there. Well, the O'Kelly movement then is going to spread. There will be more of them, but they're mostly in Virginia and North Carolina, although you will find some in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Kentucky. What do they hold to? Well, they say we want to use the Bible. We don't want to use any creeds, such as you see here, the Apostles' Creed. They don't want to use creeds. Creeds are summaries of faith statements, and some of them are quite long. This one is an fairly early one and short one. But they don't want to use creeds. They just want to use the Bible. We'll find this is a pretty common thing throughout the Restoration movement. And then also allowing private interpretation. What that means is you don't have just one interpretation that everyone has to follow. People can sort of make up their own mind. They were going to have, as far as their government, local autonomy with conferences. So there is going to be a regional or conference overarching it. The local congregations have a lot of authority, however. Okay, now, one thing we didn't mention in that was about baptism. So that is going to become an issue. Membership was based upon Christian character, they said. If someone is living like a Christian, acting like a Christian, talking like a Christian, then we assume they are a Christian. And of course, remember, they're coming out of the Methodist movement where basically everyone is, most people are sprinkled as infants. So baptism was mainly by sprinkling, and of course, primarily of infants. William Gyrie is going to be someone who argues for immersion, that baptism should be done by immersion. The term baptism is actually a transliteration of the Greek word baptizo. Baptizo in Greek means to dip or to plunge or to immerse. And so he's saying, well, we ought to really follow what the Greek word says, immersion. Now, this is going to create some tension because, you know, most of these people, many of them have not been immersed, and so they have to now deal with this idea. And eventually, a group of churches then who agree there should be immersion form their own conference, form their own group. It's called the Virginia Christian Conference. Okay? All right, so that is the Southern movement, an introduction and the Southern movement. All right, so let's move on then to the New England movement or the Eastern movement. We have two main characters here, Elias Smith, and we're going to have a guy named Jones. Now, the Southern movement is connected with Methodist, but the New England movement is actually connected with Baptist. It begins with Baptist church connections. Elias Smith, see pictured here, says minister of the New Testament, 1769 to 1846. He was born in Connecticut. He was raised in Vermont. Remember, the Baptists even here, many of them were Calvinists. Most of them were Calvinists, and they believed you had to have a conversion experience. His conversion experience was a log fell on him, and he survived, and he felt like God had spared him, and therefore he was a Christian. He was later ordained as a Baptist minister. Now, as he is preaching and as he is being a Baptist minister, he begins to doubt certain things. He has questions about predestination and Calvinism. He has questions about creeds. He has questions about the hierarchy of the church. So these questions all sort of bother him, plague him as he is moving through his time as a Baptist minister here in New England. Here's another of these leaders. His name is Abner Jones, 1772 to 1841. Born in Massachusetts, raised in Vermont. Again, a Baptist preacher. He hears Smith preaching, and you know, he also is having questions about predestination, and then this causes him to abandon the idea of Calvinism or predestination. He's going to start a congregation in 1801 in Linden, Connecticut, and he just calls it a Christian church. Okay? not a Baptist church, not a Methodist church, but a Christian church. He begins another congregation in 1802 in Hanover, New Hampshire. So we start to see these churches growing in New Hampshire, in Connecticut, and so forth, here in New England, Vermont. So Smith and Jones, it's sometimes called the Smith and Jones movement, or the New England movement of the Restoration movement. But in 1803, Smith and Jones team up. They start several churches around Boston, Massachusetts, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and so forth. They end up leaving the Baptist church, and in 1805, they both say we don't want to follow any creeds. We just want to follow the Bible, just want to follow the New Testament. They said they wanted their New Testament to be their only and all-sufficient rule of practice. So this is starting to sound familiar. And then one interesting thing that's going to be a part of the Restoration movement for many years is the use of periodicals, that is, publications. In 1805, Smith begins what he calls the Christian Magazine. In 1808, he expands this into a religious newspaper. He begins to publish a religious newspaper. Here you see a facsimile of the front page, the Herald of Gospel Liberty. And what he's talking here is the liberty from creeds. Because remember, these creeds often dictated that you had to hold to predestination. So this is usually considered to be the very first religious newspaper in the United States. Okay. Now, this Smith and Jones movement of Christian churches, or restoration kind of movement, spreads in New England, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Northern Ohio, and even into areas of Canada. And so this is a very important movement. Now, the Eastern Christians, what did they believe? Believer's baptism. They believed in immersion, that it ought to be of someone who understands what's going on. They also emphasize unity. We ought to be one. They also emphasize local autonomy with a conference. Sounds a lot like what they're doing down in the South, especially with Gyrie and the Virginia Conference. And so we see now that these movements are going to find out about each other, and are going to continue to grow together. And we'll talk more about that later on.